All right, my English teacher friends, welcome to another writing workshop with yours truly, Christian Kuhn, affectionately known as the Bob Ross of composition. So if you've been following me, you know that I've made 3 units that I'm going to begin next academic year with. There's 3 things I find to be the bane of the English teacher's existence. 1, cell phones. And I made a synthesis essay around cell phones and whether or not they should be banned in school settings or not. So that's in my YouTube channel. The other is the presence of Chat GPT and artificial intelligence and the commitment cheating that occurs as the result of those new technologies. And the third thing I want to focus on is the engagement gap. So ever since COVID, I have found that student engagement has really plummeted. And I'm going to begin next academic year with this exploration of self-motivation synthesis essay. I want to gauge right from the start of the academic year, why is it that some of my students just systematically tune out and kind of sabotage their academic career. And this is a fantastic unit to kind of figure out who's going to be your player and who's going to be that kid who just doesn't do much at all. And it's kind of a kick a kid in the pants right from the onset of the school year in terms of get motivated, buy in, and really pay attention to what's going on. So in this writing workshop, I'm also going to use my Lego Man template to construct this particular essay. So let's talk about that. So in synthesis, we know that there are requisite parts. There are things that one needs to do within this particular expository mode. And come to find out that building a synthesis essay has exactly as many parts as a Lego man. So what we're going to do is as we construct each part of the synthesis essay, the student is going to cobble together a Lego man. So let's say, for example, they either declare or invert the thesis. They got their tier 2 in there. They're focusing on their sentence constructs. It's exactly 4 sentences. Then they are awarded the head, the eyes, the nose, the mouth, right? And I'll go through all of that with you. So we're going to be using my templates of the declarative inverted thesis as well as the syllogistic method for body paragraphs. We'll be using my stems for conclusion paragraphs, my 5-word rule for embedding quotes. So the whole thing is going to come together here. I have a whole bunch of models and exemplars to totally demystify the process for teachers and students. So let's break this down. And we'll just go piece by piece here. So let's start with the prompt. Here it is, all right? And I think this is a very important question to ask students very early in the academic year because I find that oftentimes juniors and seniors in particular lack foresight. They don't see that they're coming to the inevitable end of their high school careers and don't understand that the habits that they have instilled as teenagers ultimately will follow them into adulthood. So here's the question. To what extent does your current level of motivation and effort align with your future goals? So to what extent does your current level of motivation and effort align with your future goals? I'm a firm believer of the idea that habits create and construct identity. I think that our identities largely are a composite of our habits. And I really want students to kind of take a look at the habits that they are forming and shaping their identities around at this stage of their academic careers and their lives. So there's a little bit more to this prompt. So let's unpack it just a tad bit more. And here's kind of my preface for it. One thing is crystal clear about today's classroom. Lots of students have disengaged and lost their motivation to learn. While the reasons are numerous, the fact of the matter is that disengagement and apathy have become the new normal for a lot of students. But it is not an all or nothing proposition. Many students, on the flip side, are thriving. For this assignment, which is 1 part personal reflection and 1 part synthesis essay, you will be given an opportunity to critically assess whether or not your motivation is aligned with your goals. So one thing that you'll find in the description of the video, you'll find the source packet. So I put together 7 sources. The first one's really cool. It's a self-motivation survey where the kids, it's kind of like a dating profile, if you will, where you answer a series of questions and then you get a score as to your level of motivation and whether or not it's aligned with your goal. It's very fascinating. Kids really like that. So the link to those sources is in the description. So here's what we got to do. If we break down both aspects of the prompt here, here's what we have to do. Carefully read the accompanying sources and take the self-survey. So I help students with that. I kind of show them what I think is worthy of underlining and annotating and just go through that process with them. And I walk them through the survey. For this paper, since it is a self-reflection, you may write in the first person when appropriate to do so. And again, I'll model how to do that. Even though we are not writing within the context of a singular expository mode, we will nonetheless incorporate the templates we've been using over the course of the academic year. And then the last one, you need to draw from and incorporate at least 3 of the sources. As always, you can locate your own source material to help you advance your line of reasoning. So some students, just in running this already, some students asked if they could go outside of the 7 sources that I provided because they wanted to really isolate particular things about their personality and their habits. And I said, sure, go for it. So they're doing their own research. Pretty cool. So one thing that will become crystal clear to you as we go through this is one of my old adages here. You got to Bob Ross your instruction and provide plenty of models and exemplars. So it's very easy for teachers to talk into the ether about, technique and theory with regards to composition, but it's a whole other thing if we Bob Ross our instruction. And here's what I mean by that. There's a seismic difference between the assigning of writing and the direct explicit teaching of it. And one of the little known facts about Bob Ross is that he used a template every single time he painted, and it's called a heuristic in painting, and it's known as the wet on wet technique. Every single time he ever painted a natural landscape, he employed the wet on wet technique. And every single time my students engage in expository writing, so whether it be rhetorical analysis, lit analysis, argument, persuasion, synthesis, even research, they declare or they invert the thesis and they tackle all body paragraphs syllogistically. In order to really demystify this and make it like explicitly concrete and tangible for students, I get to the proverbial easel and canvas and I paint countless exemplars and models with them so that they totally know what to do when they're looking at a blank sheet of paper or their blank screens. So the very first question that a student's going to ask of themselves after they read the prompt and we've gone through the sources is this. So, how do I construct the introductory paragraph? And I've alluded to this already. You can declare or invert the thesis. So here's what we got to do, right? Before we even break down declarative and inverted, the template. Your thesis must do 2 things. Speak to your level of motivation and then answer the essential question, which again is your current motivational state in alignment with your goals? So you got to kind of have to multitask here with this. So let's break down the declarative thesis first. And with this, you begin with the thesis. And I like this model, especially for struggling and emerging students, because oftentimes as I'm milling around the room, just observing my students write their introductions, some students have that learned helplessness, which is a terrible trait to have as a student. But they'll say, I don't know what to do, even though I've shown them like 3 declarative and 3 inverted theses that I've written for them, they still don't know what to do. And I'll just pose the essential question to them. And I'll say, answer that question. And as they begin to speak, I'll say, write that down immediately. What you just said, exactly write it down. Because what they're articulating when they answer the question is the thesis. So this is very easy approach to get kids unstuck. So you got to provide a little bit of context and background as well. A couple of rules. You don't want to quote anything from the sources. You do not want to paraphrase anything from the sources. You don't even want to mention the sources. The thesis is to keep your argument central. So all we want to hear is student voice in that. So answer the essential question, a little bit of context and background. And then the key also is this. Even though it's one part personal reflection, it is an academic paper nonetheless. So I do want to see a tad bit of tier 2 level vocabulary. And what I mean by that is just your simple, average, run-of-the-mill SAT caliber word. I do intensive word study academies throughout the academic year, so I know when I inherit my students in September that there's a seismic vocabulary void, and to help students augment their vocabulary, I have hundreds of vocabulary exercise to help them get, a good bank, a good reservoir of tier 2 level words. The other thing I do is I run a nuance academy, and I help my students with their voice, rhythm, and flow. Again, struggling emerging writers tend to use 2 out of the 12 sentence constructs. So they use independent clauses and short, simple declarative sentences, and they write their entire essay just wielding those, syntactical sentences. And it ends up yielding a da-dot kind of rhythm. Strunk and White, in their seminal text called Write It Right, assert that there's 12 different ways to cobble together a single sentence. They call it rule number 18. My students are really well versed in rule number 18. So as they're going towards, sophistication, voice, rhythm, flow, you have to be a syntactical ninja in many ways and know the purpose of a sentence, know the purposes of the sentence constructs. And then the kicker, every single one of my introductions are going to be 4 sentences long, no more, no less. So an introductory paragraph is always 4 sentences long, no matter what. So we can also flip this atop its head and invert the thesis. And in this case, all we do is we end with the thesis. We're going to end by answering the essential question. So a student might begin with a hook and an analogy or the context in the background, but you're doing the same thing. You're going to sprinkle in some tier 2, have some sentence constructs going so that you're not paralleling your syntax and creating that droning rhythm. And again, it's going to be exactly 4 sentences long. So students often ask, is one better than the other? Is the declarative better than the inverted or vice versa? And it really doesn't matter. I think both are very effective. It's just a matter of how you structure it. So let's build this together. I'm going to show you how to construct the head of the Lego man. The head is going to be the composite of everything that must be done in the introductory paragraph. So here's exemplar number 1 that a student wrote. So you can see the use of the I statement right out of the bat. And I know this drives some teachers nuts, but you got to keep in mind this is one part personal reflection. So it's totally fine if they say I. And it's also the first paper that they're doing of the academic year, so I can break them of this habit later on. So just getting the gears going here. So here it is. I am as lazy as they come. If my future goals are to play video games way past a reasonable bedtime, have zero work ethic, and waste my days accomplishing absolutely nothing, then I'm right on track. But I have bigger aspirations than this. Here's the bottom line. I need to undergo a radical transformation, and soon, if I want to actualize my future goals. So this has got a lot going on in it. So let's break it down in terms of constructing the Lego man. And I should have said this earlier. If you don't have physical Legos, kids can do this with crayons, markers, pens. I've actually used Play-Doh for it and made little claymation Legos. So whatever you want to do is totally fine. I often just use crayons to expedite the process. So here's the thing. In terms of constructing the Lego man head, if the student answers the essential question to a satisfactory level, they are awarded the head. If they have the context in the background, the eyes and brows are awarded. It's arbitrary, but I want to see a minimum of 2 tier 2 level words just to practice, especially early in the academic year. So that's going to be the mouth, and then the variety of sentence constructs is the hair. And if the grammar, the punctuation, and the syntax is totally copacetic, then they can accessorize with beards and mustaches and glasses and sideburns and all that kind of stuff. So let's break it down bit by bit. Does this first student get the head? Did they do it? And it's yes, they did. They have an inverted thesis. This last sentence, the last sentence of the fourth, is the thesis statement, and it says, here's the bottom line. I need to undergo a radical transformation, and soon, if I want to actualize my future goals. So they are awarded the head. Now, did they have the 3 sentences of context and background to get the eyes and the brows? Because this is good. This is like how you see the whole line of reasoning for the rest of the essay. And they began, the first 3 sentences are the context and background. And here it is, just to replay it. I am as lazy as they come. If my future goals are to play video games way past a reasonable bedtime, have zero work ethic, and waste my days accomplishing absolutely nothing, then I'm right on track. But I have bigger aspirations than this. So this student would get the eyes and the brows. Did they use a minimum of 2 tier 2 level words to award themselves the mouth? And they did. They actually had 4: aspiration, actualize, ensuring, radical. Because you can see here, the idea is not to use $1 million words. I want the kid to sound natural. I don't want them to sound pretentious or contrived or like they're forcing their vocab. Stay in the wheelhouse, stay in your lane, and choose words that fit, right? Fit your discourse. And these words the student owns. It doesn't sound forced at all. They did a great job. So let's take a look at rule number 18, the sentence constructs. I really like a lot of these sentence constructs here. So just begin with a simple declarative sentence. And then as you go through here, you can see some parentheticals, you can see you see a dash, you see a colon. And then I really like what happens after the colon. I need to undergo a radical transformation, comma, and soon, comma, if I want to actualize my future goals. So there's great rhythm in this, great voice rhythm and flow. It doesn't have that choppy dot rhythm. The student really is doing some nice ninja work with their syntax, and I think that is really cool. And then if I'm editing this paper, I would say, kid, you can accessorize because your grammar, your punctuation, your syntax is flawless from start to finish. So this kid has definitely been awarded the Lego head and all of its parts. So that might be a little confusing, and that's why I always model a few times for my students. So let's do that again. Let's have student number 2 step to the plate and show us their introduction. So again, it's going to be 4 sentences. Either thesis comes first, thesis comes last. We need 3 sentences of context and background. We're going to sprinkle in some tier 2, focus on those sentence constructs for voice, rhythm, flow, sophistication. So this is what student number 2 did. COVID showed the cracks in our system and all the reasons why working hard is for naught. First, my generation will not have the same opportunities as those who came before us. Therefore, working my tail off to get good grades, to get into a good college, to have an amazing career just seems pointless. Further, because everything feels so irreparably broken, I am like many of my peers in that I simply feel like giving up before I even begin the next phase of my post high school life. All right, let's do the exact same thing with this one as we did with number one. As you can see here, this kid has the head, the eyebrows, the eyes, the mouth, and they even accessorize. This guy's got a rainbow wig going for himself. So let's break down all the parts here, and we'll take it from the top here. So the last sentence answers the essential question. So just take a look at this again and hear it. Further, because everything feels so irreparably broken, I'm like many of my peers in that I simply feel like giving up before I even begin the next phase of my post-high school life. So that speaks directly to the essential question. The first three sentences are the context and background. And again, let's talk about what not to do. We're not mentioning the sources. We're not quoting. We're not paraphrasing. The student's argument is central, which is what we need. Vocab is up. There's some really nice vocab in here, without overdoing it, but they got a minimum of two tier 2 level words. And then the sentence constructs do not run parallel to each other. Everything's varied. There's great syntactical variation in this. And again, they've achieved that nice voice rhythm and flow, and the grammar, the punctuation, the syntax is point on, spot on. So I would award this kid everything that is involved in constructing the head of the Lego man. All right. Yes, you can do this. You absolutely can. So I know some students that might be painting along with me might say, this is hard. This is really hard. But let me do it one more time. And hopefully we can unpack this for you and really simplify it, because it's always going to be 4 sentences. Answer the essential question first or last. Context, background, a tad bit of tier 2. Focus on those sentence constructs. And you're going to notice here too, in terms of the accessorization point, I really teach grammar, punctuation, syntax very thoroughly. I demand mastery of it. So you'll see my students using dashes and colons and semicolons and, no comma splices. I really, really demand excellence, especially at the AP level. If a kid's going to be in contention for the sophistication point, you can't be making too many errors along those lines. So here's student number 3. The world is an oyster, and I was put on this earth to achieve great things. So that has not answered the question yet. So this is going to be inverted, I'm going to assume. With my faith in a higher power and the idea that I have a purpose in life, I'm deeply motivated to do everything I can to be a bright light to change the world for the better. But all of this just does not happen by its own volition. I must work hard for all that I want to achieve. Therefore, I am determined and motivated to do whatever it takes to live a life that leaves an everlasting impact. All right, well, that sounds pretty good. Let's break this down just like we did the first one. So if they answer the essential question, they get the head. If they have the context and background, the eyes and the brows are awarded. Minimum of 2 tier 2 level words, they get the mouth. Variety in the sentence structures is awarded the hair. And then grammar, punctuation, syntax, they can jazzercise this head and accessorize it. So here it is again. You can see that the last sentence answers the essential question. So this is a straight up inverted thesis. They have some tier 2 level vocab in here. I spy with my little eye that they used a dash, and I don't want students to think that you always have to use dashes and colons and semicolons. Most of the times, commas just fine, but I do teach expressive syntax, and I want my students to be able to wield a variety of syntactical features. So that's good. And then the punctuation is flawless and it's exactly 4 sentences long. So this kid gets it all as well. And you see here, it's really not that difficult to do this. So let's see it again, just to make sure that we fully understand how to do this. And again, usually when I'm Bob Rossing my instruction for students, I usually do things 3 or 4 times. Keep in mind that this is the first essay of the year for my students. So just to really get them comfortable with my template and unpack it, illustrate how to pull the strings of it, I'm going to show 4 exemplars. So here's number 4. Our current political and social situation, I'm going to take that from the top. Our current political and social situation has left me with an overwhelming meh kind of feeling with regards to my future. We are neither here nor there, in that while we are a country with plenty, we are simultaneously a nation splitting at the seams. While it's hard to stay motivated when the news and social media constantly paints a bleak picture of the world, it's important to stay motivated and to have dreams, goals, and aspirations. For these reasons, I will continue to push on with a determined focus and to work hard so that I can achieve the goals I've set forth for myself. So some of you might be very astute and say, geez, Christian, all 4 of these inverted. And that's what I determined in my Bob Ross samples that I showed students to produce these samples that you're seeing. I found it rather brusque and abrupt to answer the essential question right out of the gate. It seemed rather arbitrary, and I felt that it was best when I provided some context and background, like introduced myself before dropping the thesis. And most of my students went the route of the inverted. And that's one of the blessings and the benefits of Bob Rossing your instruction, is that you can give pointers to students because you know your assignment. You've done your assignment before they've done it, and you can really kind of guide them through it and give them tips and pointers. So if you are painting along with me and doing this assignment in class, I would pause the video here and work on the introductions before going any further. Workshop them. Students, take a look at a bunch of your peers, because I'm a firm believer that the more writing you see, the better you become. And just talk to each other. Offer advice. Have many, many eyes on your writing. Don't be shy. Don't be bashful. That's how you become a better writer. So the next question we need to ask ourselves is this. So how do I write the body paragraphs? And it's really quite easy. We're going to use something called the syllogistic method, and this is rooted in the Aristotelian tradition. It comes from Aristotle's school, the Lyceum, and at that school, they would also tussle with juicy essential questions, but they often would go a little more philosophical. So in a classic text called Plato's Republic, just to cite one example, they grapple with the question, what is justice? And these great orators, philosophers, scholars would come to the proverbial mic and they would drop their definition of what justice is. And Aristotle said, geez, some kids are better at this than others. And he wanted to open up the lid of the really good orators. And one day he had a eureka moment. He said, I got it. I know why they're so good at housing their arguments. They are thinking syllogistically. They're packaging their arguments in a syllogistic construct, which is very mathematical and computative. And all a syllogism is when we go from premise, conclusion. So here's an example. If I were to say to you, premise number 1, arsenic is deadly, you'd all nod your head and say, yep, Christian, you are 100% correct. But then if I follow it with some support and say, premise number 2, my dog ate arsenic, we're naturally, deductively going to conclude that's not going to bode well for Christian's dog. Christian's dog's probably going to die. Right? That's logic. And when we argue on paper, we want to be very logical. Your teachers might call that establishing the line of reasoning. Aristotle called it cogency, which is going to be a word that I use in the rest of the writing workshop. To be cogent is mathematical. To be cogent is computative, methodic. All the parts of the logic are there. So how do we turn that syllogistic method into a template for the purposes of writing synthesis. It's very easy, actually. So the first premise we're going to designate as the argument containing the why reason. Go back to the thesis for a second. All we did was answer the essential question. We did not state why. So the why comes in the first premise, and we're going to take 3 sentences to write that why reason to make sure that the argument stays central, right? On AP language exam, FRQ1, the College Board states that a few times. Your argument must be central. So even if you're doing this for on-level students, I like to have the argument central. So no quotes, no paraphrases, no summation in those first 3 sentences. Just the articulation of a why reason. And I'm going to model that a few times for you. So just sit tight. Second premise is going to be the quoting and the paraphrasing. We don't want to do one far more at the expense of the other. So we're going to teeter-totter balance that. We have to remember that we need to include a minimum of 3 sources. So we're going to draw from those texts. And then the conclusion of the paragraph, the conclusion of the syllogistic paragraph, and I really want to articulate that. You got to conclude your body paragraphs, just like you need a conclusion on your essay, a conclusion paragraph. You got to conclude your body paragraphs. This is our links and our echo and our promise back to the prompt and the thesis. All of this is going to take about 10 to 12 sentences. So those little itty bitty 4 or 5 sentence bagger paragraphs that kids are so used to writing, don't cut it for synthesis. So a good synthesis paragraph is 10 to 12 sentences. So let's go back to the idea of constructing the Lego man. The torso is going to be the first premise. And I will demonstrate this for you a few times because some of you might be asking yourselves, so how do I write a first premise? And it's not that hard. So here's an example. I'll give you some sentence stems. So students that really struggle with this, or you're stumped and this isn't making sense, you can steal these stems from me. I have found that when students say reason why, in the first premise, they therefore will articulate the reason why. So if you're going singular, if there's just a singular reason why, you can begin your first premise by stating this. There is a clear reason as to why. And you just finish that sentence. But if you want to multitask and focus on a couple of things in your syllogism, you can say there are a couple of reasons why. So it does not matter. So there's a clear reason as to why, or there are a couple of reasons why. So let's flesh out all 3 sentences. And this is where you're going to begin to build your line of reasoning. And I'm going to talk about the promise of the first premise in just a second here. You got to keep in mind, you're promising your reader that you're going to have support and analysis for a couple of things here. So let's look at this. As soon as we went into lockdown a few years ago, my motivation went out the window. Given that I was cut off from seeing friends, playing sports, and going to school, I fell into a slump and basically huddled myself in my bedroom, not accomplishing much with my days. But since then, now that schools are reopened and life has gotten back to semi-normal, I'm stuck in this pattern and can't seem to break it. All right, so if we are to break this down, what is the kid promising us? And I'm expecting support and analysis that focuses on behavioral patterns, right? That you got into some habits and you're having a hard time breaking them. So all the quotes or paraphrases should be about that. Maybe you'll quote a little bit about the effect that the COVID pandemic had on teenagers and the level of motivations. There's an article in the source packet dealing with that. So you got to go get all your quotes and paraphrases that help you keep the promise of that first premise. So before we move on to the second premise and the whole rest of the body paragraph, let's see that one more time. Let's see one more first premise and really make sure that we're getting our heads around this. So here's another one. So many things changed since the pandemic started because when life came to a halt, many cracks in the system were exposed. This is especially true of the American educational system. When schools shut down for a number of months, the sheer dysfunction and ineffectiveness of long-standing practices became increasingly clear. So you can see here in the first premise, let's talk about what not to do. No quotes, no paraphrases, no summation. It's the centralized argument of the student, and it's a promise. It's a why reason. So this student, if they're going to continue, really needs some quotes and or paraphrases that are going to focus on the dysfunction of the American educational system. That COVID really exposed some bad tendencies and habits, long-standing habits in the educational system. And that's what they're going to focus on if they're going to have a clear, sustained line of reasoning. So just to reiterate this, the first premise, 3 sentences, argue the why reason. So if I'm going to open up the lid of my brain and demonstrate for students how I write, when I'm done with my first premise, I go quote hunting. I get into the packet, look at my annotations, and make sure that I have enough quotes and or paraphrases to keep the promise of the first premise. So, for example, that second one that we just looked at, they're going to need education quotes, right? If you're going to stay germane to the promise of the first premise, they're going to need a whole bunch of quotes about education. And students often ask me this: how many quotes do I need per body paragraph? I find when I write, I typically quote 3 times in a body paragraph. So I tell them, you're synthesizing, so synthesis is a plural word, so you at least need to do it twice, but I don't like minimum expectations. I usually go 3 times. Sometimes I might go 4 times, but I tell my students shoot for 3. All right, let's put the whole Lego man together here. Let's add to the parts. So a syllogistic body paragraph is going to be 10 to 12 sentences. So before a student is awarded anything, they have to hit 10 to 12 sentences. So the head is done. We have our declarative or inverted thesis, and we have the eyebrows and the eyes and the mouth, and we've accessorized. That's done perfect. The torso is going to be the first premise. But now we need those quotes and paraphrases, and that is going to constitute the arms. So the arms of each quote must wrap around the promise, right? I'm trying to be metaphoric here and give an analogy. So the arms are the quotes, the paraphrases, and they wrap around the first premise. This really ensures that the line of reasoning stays intact, because you just can't arbitrarily, willy-nilly quote, right? Everything needs to be germane. If the student has more tier 2 and they're focusing on those sentence constructs, then you can get spiffy with the attire and you can dress that torso. And then the legs are the 2 to 3 sentence conclusion of the body paragraph, where you have the link, the echo, and the promise. So let's take this all from the top. And I'll show you how to do this a couple of times. So let's revisit the first premise, 3 sentences, why reason. As soon as we went into lockdown 2 years ago, my motivation went out the window. Given that I was cut off from seeing friends, playing sports, and going to school, I fell into a slump and basically huddled myself in my bedroom, not accomplishing much with my days. But since then, now that schools are reopened and life has gotten back to semi-normal, I'm stuck in this pattern and can't seem to break it. So we talked about quote hunting. We talked about keeping, the promise of the first premise. Let's see what happens in the second premise. So you can see I've indicated here, this is going to be kind of the pith of the syllogistic body paragraph. We need a certain degree of quotes and or paraphrases in order to keep the promise of that first premise. So the 4th sentence marks the transition into the second premise. Note all the quotes and paraphrases in here and how they stay germane to the promise of the first premise, right? We want these arms to go around the torso. We're going to give ourselves like a self-hug. So 4th sentence, I tell my students, get quoting, get paraphrasing. So look what this student does in the 4th sentence. What it ultimately boils down to is that for a person to embark on a project, he has to value the return on his labor more than his loss of comfort. It comes from the 3rd article. So one thing we'll talk about in here is the 5-word rule, and I had that on the previous slide. When a student quotes, if they put a minimum of 5 words in front of the quote and keep the quote relatively small, it should sound conversational. You will need to teach your students how to bracket to ensure that conversational tone, and I'll model that in a second. So we quoted, now we need to analyze it. The problem is this. In our uncertain times, no one knows, especially the kids in my generation, if there will be a return on investment. And again, note the sentence constructs here, just like we were talking about in the introduction. Same with the tier 2. You don't want to lag on that. Keep it consistent. It is a truth that nobody knows what tomorrow holds, but we all know that there's a reason to be fearful and cautious given the current situation. In this regard, therefore, I am motivated by fear. But the problem with this form of motivation is that there is only one side of the coin, and that the fear is strong enough to prevent you from quitting. And that comes from the Buckley article. All right, so we've quoted twice, and we're seeing here, when you quote, you have to analyze it, and it all is under the umbrella of the first premise. There is another aspect of this, however. What if the fear is so overwhelming that it stops a person dead in their tracks and they become so absolutely stymied by terrifying what-if scenarios? This is what happened in my instance, and I love the personal reflection here. This is what I really like about this paper. But you can see they're still using the template nonetheless. The future is so uncertain and is seemingly very bleak, so much so that obtaining my life goals feels like an impossibility. In looking at my survey results, so this is source number 3, going to the survey, it is clear that my imagination gets the better of me because I often get waylaid by fear-based thinking. Given my personality and temperament, in the face of fear, I, in a sense, play dead. Robinson calls this the opossum effect, in that most of us are still hardwired to our lizard brains in terms of our fight or flight responses. So you can see here the kid quoted 3 times. They used 3 sources. They quoted 3 times. That's typically what I do when I model. But all the quotes and paraphrases, the support and the analysis, definitely are germane and linked, connected to the promise of the first premise. But we're not done. We still need to add the legs to this Lego man and conclude our syllogism. And again, this usually just takes 2 or 3 sentences. It's a quick wrap up. Go all the way back to the thesis. Go all the way back to the prompt. So look at what the student did here. I am not as lazy or unmotivated as I may project. Because of COVID and how that altered things greatly for me and my peers, I simply got stuck in the rut of some bad patterns that I need to break. Knowing is half the battle. Now I just need to get motivated and make some strides forward. So I would award the kid the legs. The grammar punctuation is perfect. Some fantastic tier 2 in here. The sentence constructs are nice and supple and fluid. There's nothing choppy about it. This is some fantastic writing, but most importantly, the line of reasoning stays perfectly intact. This kid connected all of the dots. So I would award them everything they need to construct this aspect of the Lego. So we're an intro done. We're 1 body paragraph done. The question becomes, what do I do next? Well, here's the deal. You bust out another syllogism. This is going to be a 4-paragraph essay. Intro, 2 bodies, and a conclusion. And I'm often asked at the AP level, because I teach Lang and Lit, how many paragraphs do my students do on the exam? And believe it or not, my students only do 4 paragraphs. And I know some of the traditional 5-paragraph pundits are like, oh my goodness, your kids must tank bomb their scores. And it's just not true. If they're doing 10 to 12 sentence body paragraphs, 4 paragraphs is plenty. So I've kind of ditched the 5-paragraph essay long ago. 4 paragraphs is plenty, plenty, plenty. So what do we do? Let's play this all again. So what does this 3rd paragraph look like, the second body paragraph? You just reload. You're going to have a first premise that's going to be 3 sentences long. So let's take a look at this. Just change the why reason. So many things changed since the pandemic started because when life came to a halt, many cracks in the system were exposed. This is especially true of the American educational system. When schools shut down for a number of months, the sheer dysfunction and ineffectiveness of long-standing practices became increasingly clear. Same thing, fourth sentence, get quoting, get paraphrasing. And everything needs to be tied to the dysfunctional components of the educational system if we're going to be awarded the arms, right? The quotes, the paraphrases need to hug this torso, right? We're giving ourselves a self-hug here. So everything needs to focus on education and how COVID exposed a lot of the faults and flaws in the educational system. So let's see what this student did. Fourth sentence begins second premise. But now that schools have reopened under what are somewhat normal conditions, teachers are reporting that a large percentage of their students are disengaged, apathetic, refusing to do the work, and intellectually shut off. So again, 5-word rule for those quotes to keep them conversational. So we quoted, let's analyze that quote. The reason for this is because attitudes have changed. While attitudinal motivation typically deals with a person's negative thinking and stubbornness, a shift occurred during COVID in that people learned that the schooling system was predominantly grading a student's willingness to comply, not assess aptitude or learning. So now we got 2 quotes in here. We got 2 sources. Quote, analyze. In all honesty, the curriculum in my school unmotivates me. As a 16-year-old junior in high school whose future is so uncertain and rocky, I cannot for the life of me understand how I am to get enthusiastically motivated to read books like Gatsby and Macbeth and feel so disconnected from the issues that seem so pressing in my everyday life. Sure, it can be argued that reading the classics is important, but let's be honest. How is this serving me in the here and now? The short answer is this. And again, look at the expressive syntax here, use of this dash. It is not. Buckley contends that goals associated with self-awareness and self-change will be met with attitude motivation. I couldn't disagree more. And I love the fact that kids are arguing against the experts here. This kid is basically trashing this source's thesis statement here. You talk about sophistication, right? If you're doing this at the AP level, great instructional practice here for FRQ 1 as they're going for the unicorn point. Given that the curriculum in my school is so far removed from what's actually going on in my life, I actually have shut down and simply don't care to play the game of school anymore. So the exact same process here. Like students, typically for me, they quote 3 times in the body paragraph. And then just like the first one, we're not done. You can't end on a quote. You got to throw some legs on this Lego man. So let's make this guy stand. Let's have this body paragraph stand with a conclusion. There are so many issues in the world that teenagers are forced to shoulder in the new normal. If school systems continue to refuse to acknowledge this, then they cannot complain about kids checking out and disengaging. Motivation and personal relevance go hand in hand. Let's make school relevant and see what happens. So again, that's a very cogent argument right there. It stayed perfectly intact. The promise of the first premise was there. Arms are awarded all day long. Give yourself a self-hug because that stayed really connected. And I think this student did a great job. 10 to 12 sentences. They have enough support and analysis in there. Everything is linked, connected. Good tier 2, good sentence constructs. Award this kid everything that is promised in this Lego Man template. It was perfect. So if you're painting with me here, I would pause and have your students work on those first premises, go quote hunting, and really work on that line of reasoning, 10 to 12 sentences. And maybe you want to model this a few times for your students. We're not done though. We have our introductions done, our 2 body paragraphs are done, but we need to wrap up the essay. And the essay is going to be the feat. Or sorry, the essay, I misspoke. The conclusion is going to be the feat, right? We need something to stand on here. In my classroom, I have a poster and it has 15 sentence stems that we use for conclusion paragraphs across the expository modes. And over the course of the academic year, my students become very familiar with these sentence stems, and oftentimes they kind of glob on to 3 or 4 of them that they systematically use. And I liken the conclusion paragraph to kind of the grand finale of a fireworks display. It's the climatic crescendo. It's the big theme focus at the end. And I just basically, when I Bob Ross this, I'm yelling theme, 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 hammer the prompt right at the end. And it takes 3 to 4 sentences. So let's take a look at one student sample, and they are using the sentence stem, simply said, comma. So students steal this from my poster. Simply said. So simply said, comma, I know that my current levels of motivation are not in alignment with my desired trajectory, right? So again, go all back to the prompt. You hammer prompt, hammer thesis. Given this, it is clear that I need to reevaluate things and get myself on a new, healthier path. This is what must happen if I am to actualize my dreams. So it took 3 sentences. And that's what my friends do when they construct their essays. And now the last thing, all right, going back to my Nuance Academy, is if the student has really stellar grammar, punctuation, and syntax, I allow them to accessorize this Lego man. And here's the kicker right at the end. How do we grade all of these things? And some of you are familiar with my work in certain circles with my alternative grading method. So over the course of my career, I've created over 100 alternative grading methods. I just feel that the traditional grading paradigm doesn't work all that well in terms of fostering growth and maturation in student writers. I think we could put a gazillion comments in the margin of a student's paper, and they will not grow or mature as a writer. It's a waste of time. And it's like we sign up for compulsory, unpaid overtime with the traditional grading paradigm, and it's one of the most futile things we do. So you can use an alternative grading method for this and actually have some peer editing go on. So what I did was I grouped my students in groups of 4, and I had peers basically create the Lego man for the student's particular draft. So let's say student number 1 gives their paper to student number 2. Student number 2 reads student number 1's paper and constructs the Lego man, and they say things like, hey man, your Lego man, I can't award it the arms because you have some real arbitrary quotes in here. You promise to be talking about the cracks in the educational system, but you're talking about after-school youth sports programs, and it just doesn't make sense. That doesn't stay germane to the promise of the first premise. So you got to change your quote selection and keep everything in sync with your line of reasoning. And student number 1 says, oh, yeah, geez, all right. The other thing that I do, especially given that this is the first paper of the year, is I draw on a piece of paper a Lego man as I'm reading. I don't leave very many comments in the draft. I just give the student a Lego man. And let's say that it's missing the mouth. The student's going to know, oh, geez, I'm a little short on tier 2. Well, when you revise, go back and fix that. Focus on that tier 2. Or I have not accessorized the Lego man. That would be an indication that a whole bunch of grammar and punctuation syntax is wrong, and that they're going to need some extra time in my Nuance Academy building mastery towards that. All right, so I'm coming to the end here. That's the whole essay. Wishing you happy teaching and happy writing. And if you want to contact me, you can reach out at teachingwritingcoach@gmail.com. Note that the slides and the source packet are in the description in the YouTube video, so you can just download those for free. Also note that I'm a lead teacher for the National Writing Project, and I'm a lead contributor to NCTE. And we do professional development all year long. So if you want to learn about any of the PD opportunities that we have, you can go to my website, which is teachinghowtowrite.com, and go up to my NWP courses in the header and just click that, and you'll have a drop down menu and you can see everything that we're currently offering. Cool thing about NWP is I know for a fact they are the most affordable PD, and they also give badges for completion hours. So any of you needing to satisfy certification requirements for hours, this is a great way to do it. And I know districts often pay for teachers to take PD with us because NWP's got the reputation of being excellent. So that's it from here. I hope you're well. I hope you found this to be useful and that you have great discussions about motivation and engagement going forward. And I'm wishing you a happy academic year.